right, welcome to Plug and Pay, a talk show where we talk with inspiring payroll leaders from all around the world about interesting topics that are shaping today's global payroll industry. My name is Marc Oliver Fiedler. I'm the founder and CEO of Payzar, and I'm the host of this show. Together, of course, with my dear colleague and head of service delivery at Payzar, Max van der Klies-Busink. Max, great to have you on again. How's it going, man?
It's going great, Mark. I think life is full of passion for payroll here at Payzar and across the world. So I'm happy to be back with you, my dear CEO, at another episode of Plug and Pay.
And I'm excited to see that we're in the Christmas spirit here. So we're wearing our amazing Christmas sweaters.
Yes,
so
that time of the year.
It is that time of the year to get festive. So let's talk about what's happening in payroll this time of the year, which is also exciting. And to talk a bit about that, we have a special guest today. We have Angela Wagner, VP of Global Payroll at Pearson. So Angela, welcome to Plug and Pay. Thank you for being here today with us.
And thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So as we always like to do with guests that come onto the show, we'd love to learn a bit about your background and what got you started and going in the payroll world.
Thank you for that. Well, thank you, Marc and Max, for inviting me, and really happy to be here. Well, probably like many other payroll professionals, I did not daydream as a little girl about being a payroll professional. I wanted to be a veterinarian and an engineer and a writer and probably 17 other things. I ended up becoming an accountant. So that's where my sort of formal training came into play, and worked as an accountant for a number of years. And over time, I had been introduced to payroll as sort of an extension of accounting, ended up inheriting payroll and other maybe HR related responsibilities at an organization. And that was really where I had sort of my first taste of what payroll could look and feel like. And like a lot of other individuals, I was really intrigued by the nuances of payroll. At the time, I was supporting a smaller mortgage company here in the States, and they had set up shop in another state. So I was learning about a different state than the one I lived in. And at that time, we were going through some regulatory changes with the industry, and the states were standing up a licensing model where you couldn't just wake up one day and say, I want to sell mortgages to consumers. I now have to go through a process and take a test and then be credentialed. And so that was sort of my foray into a little bit of training and then designing commission plans. And so I had a taste of a little bit of comp and the like too. But payroll was really unique. I kept getting drawn into that. And what I learned over the course of my career is that not a lot of people want to be in payroll because it is so complex. And not that other disciplines are not as equally complex. In fact, I would argue there are probably others that are by far more complex, but they don't have quite the same impact. Pay is very personal. People go to work because they have to provide for themselves and their loved ones. And so none of us do this for free. And I think that's where the added stressor comes into play. It's not so much that it is a complex discipline, but the end result, getting people paid and making sure that they have what they need to take care of themselves and their loved ones, is so important and so critical. So I think that's why a lot of folks have shied away from wanting to be responsible for payroll, because it is so sensitive, right? You're kind of in a fishbowl. If things go wrong, even if it's perceived to have gone wrong, a lot of individuals will start asking questions. So it can be challenging from that standpoint, but I love it. I love the complexity and the nuances and everything that kind of ties it all together. So I've been in the payroll space for well over 20 years, supported a lot of different industries. I've supported small organizations, large organizations, international, you name it. Would never dare to say I've seen it all. I haven't, but I've seen a lot. And it's been quite a wild ride, and has been a profession that has served me well in a number of different ways. So I love it. I hope more people become intrigued about it as a profession. And I'm excited to share a little bit about what's top of mind for me, and hopefully maybe inspire some others through maybe some of my weird or provocative ideas to maybe want to get involved and explore the payroll profession as something that they want to pursue.
That's great,
Great.
Angela. Thanks for sharing. And I guess once you're brave enough to roll into payroll, you're happy enough to never roll out of payroll. That's
Yeah.
a tagline to get everyone in. So since this episode, Angela, is coming out in the holiday season, and Mariah Carey will earn her millions of dollars again with her famous song, All I Want for Christmas. But this time we're not interested at all about what Mariah Carey wants for Christmas, Angela. We're interested, Angela, what you would like to get under your global payroll Christmas tree.
Yeah. There's so many. There's so many things. And when posed with this question, Max, I could have very easily said, well, I want better tech, or, AI, and all of those things are important. And you could probably have numerous different shows focusing on some of those other things. But for me, I can distill it down to probably three areas, or three things maybe, but three areas that I would love under my Christmas tree. And the first one I would say is an overhaul of payday across the world.
Okay.
The second would be sort of a reimagining of earned wage access technology. And then I would say lastly would be parity of payroll in the context of leadership. So those are my three top things on my payroll wish list for this Christmas.
So let's get into those a bit. Maybe let's
Yeah.
unpack those gifts
Yeah.
and find out what we imagine to be in those little boxes. So tell us about the first one,
Yeah.
the payday. What's your thought on that? What's
Yeah.
that?
I've been putting a lot of thought into what does payday represent, right? And I think, being kind of on the side of the fence that I'm on as a payroll professional, payday to me translates to the pay cycle. And I'm trying to challenge the notion of a pay cycle. There are so many dependencies that go into having a pay cycle or the pay frequency. And I'm not just talking about the mechanisms to aggregate hours worked, but I'm referring to the different methodologies for taxation based upon pay frequency, the different methodologies around how certain types of perhaps rewards or benefits get calculated and deducted. There's a lot of different methods there. And we could continue down the list of things that kind of go into, what's in your paycheck, where the pay cycle perhaps has an influence. And we humans, we have added so much complexity, and therefore everything has been made more difficult in terms of aggregation of what goes into payday. I'm not saying we should do away with things like premium pay or overtime, but where I want to challenge this notion of a pay cycle is, what if we put some of the onus and responsibility of, say, taxation back into the regulatory authorities and not bear so much of that burden as the employer? Trying to get into the nitty-gritty of how different types of remuneration gets taxed and reported is so difficult. We have an entire sort of sub-industry that just manages tax tables. And I'm just thinking in terms of just the United States. Think about every other country in the world. I'm not saying I think things would become simpler, but I do think that there has become such a dependency on the employer, to take out wage garnishments and tax levies, court orders, of course, taxes being another. And so when we think about all of those different methodologies that get applied to remuneration, that's where that level of complexity continues to increase. here in the States, what we're seeing is a trend where lots of different jurisdictions are coming up with their own paid family leave. And I think that's brilliant, right? Our federal government has failed to really put forth a comprehensive paid family leave program like other countries have done. And so the states have taken it upon themselves to institute their own. And of course, they're all different. And much of that comes out via a tax from an employee's paycheck. So where I'm kind of going with this is, there's so many different inputs that go into what makes up a pay cycle. So could we pick that apart in some way? Could we put certain types of onus again, back to whether it's a government agency or a vendor provider, if it's for a particular perk or something to that effect? I think the employer has taken on a lot of responsibility. And that's one of the things that continues to drive up labor costs is the compiling of these different types of perks and the like. So it's a very complex notion. I'd love to be able to oversimplify it in some form or fashion, but this idea that we have to wait for 2 weeks to go by or a month to go by, and then we do a look back and apply these different methodologies to determine how much money to give to someone. We've made this so difficult over the course of time. I don't know how we undo that or simplify that, but I'm interested in finding ways to somehow incubate this idea. I don't really know where to go with this, but it's something that I've been thinking about for a while now. And how might we overhaul what payday could look like? And what could that then mean for an employer and the employee? So it's just a thought.
So if we take that, what I hear you talk about is taking the burden that's currently sitting squarely on the shoulders of the employer, right, to make sure that they're withholding the right amounts of taxes, Social Security, contributions, and so on. So I wonder if we take that back to putting that, responsibility back more to the authorities, to the tax authorities, would that then sort of imply that there's going to be more sort of less gross to net? You just kind of get your gross pay, keep it simple, right?
Potentially.
And sort of the netting out of your gross happens more as part of your year-end personal tax return. So it's between you and the government,
Yeah.
but it's between you and the employer and the government, right? Which is kind of how most tax systems work at the moment.
Yeah. My personal opinion is that there are some regulatory authorities that almost don't bother to understand the rules and regulations themselves. They sort of pitch it over the fence to the employer, to
Right.
people like myself, or to payroll providers and others to say, here's the rules, you figure out how to operationalize it. And I have been on phone calls with agencies trying to get clarity on certain things, and they themselves don't always know the answer. And so to me, there's something there in that if you're going to make the rule, at a minimum, you should know what does correct look like, right? You're leaving it to the employer to try to figure out. And then if you get it wrong, however the agency has defined wrong, you're now penalized, or the employee is penalized because something wasn't, there wasn't enough tax withheld or something wasn't applied appropriately. And so, there's a little bit of where does that responsibility lie in assuring that something is even being applied correctly? And if the regulatory authorities can't define it themselves, how do they expect the employer to define it and make sure that it's right? And so that's where now would things turn out worse if that responsibility and that exchange happened between, say, the tax agency and the employee? Maybe. There could be some really horrible unintended consequences that come from that. But when I think about having to do this look back, if you will, an aggregation, not only of time worked, I do think that there's maybe something there in terms of whether it's the taxation or it's, the tax or the levies or the wage garnishments or court orders as well. So I would love to see some sort of simplification there. I don't know that we'll ever get that. But the example I shared where you've got, agents with the regulatory agency that can't articulate what the rules are, I go back to that. How do you expect an employer or their employees to really understand it themselves?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I hear you talk about the topic and the one you alluded to, Mark, where you would put more burden on the tax authorities to do kind of a reconciliation or the levy via direct income tax returns. Right? There's two countries that I'm pretty sure, Angela, you also manage a payroll for, are France and Singapore, where
Yes.
Singapore, I believe, still levies some sort of provident fund and social security levies through payroll, but income tax is solely between the individual and the governments, right?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
those that impose dreaded forms at year end and also financial and tax planning on the employee side, where they could get in trouble in terms of a
Yeah.
reconciliation. And if you would then look at France, they've introduced now, after a few years, a wage tax levy as an employer with the employee, where that used to be self-assessment too. So I think the topic you raise, Angela, is something that tax authorities also struggle with, right?
Yeah.
Because they also feel like, what's the best appropriate way to do it? And it reminds me of a study that was done in my little country, the Netherlands. I think around 10 years ago, actually of a colleague of mine at the time at PwC, who tried to look at simplifying the tax scheme to one flat levy, 1% applied across all. Well, that didn't fly because you have the strongest shoulders who bear the heaviest load and all of that. But I think it's still worth looking into, Angela, to remove complexity and make them something simple again, however complex that might be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've even talked at a previous organization. There was a specific benefit that was self-selected, and I think it was transportation related, if I'm not mistaken. And the employees that wanted to elect this option had an opportunity, or rather an option, that if they elected it for the year, they could make the payment in one lump sum and just be done with it. And very small population wanted this perk. And of that population, the majority actually did pay the lump sum up front rather than have a few dollars taken out of their paycheck over the course of the year. It wasn't a lot of money, in the grand scheme of things, as compared to some other perks or benefits that employees might typically elect. But I thought, even if there was some flexibility, right, or even some sort of incentivization of, if I want to pay all of my benefit premiums up front, could I do that and be done with it? And could I do that outside of payroll, right? So I think, it goes beyond even just sort of the regulatory component. But even as an employer, when you're offering certain types of perks or rewards, could there be some flexibility with how the money gets recovered, the timing and the frequency? So I think there could be some opportunity in that as well, where you don't have to say, here's the amount, I'm going to divide it by X number of pay frequencies, and just, is there some other alternative or alternatives that could be more financially advantageous to the employee? Maybe they could manage their cash flow a little bit differently, if they paid it quarterly instead of every paycheck. I don't know. I'm making stuff up here, but I think, the collective, we haven't really looked at what are the alternatives. And if we talk about a more concierge type of approach to delivering compensation and rewards, what could that look like? But we're all very much stuck in that, well, the vendor sends us a file, it's divided by number of pay frequency, blah, 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 and you take it out of someone's paycheck. For some people, that works great. They love it. They would not change it. I think you have other individuals, and I think of people who are just now coming into the workforce, who have a separate job. They're an influencer. They've got another job over here. They work for Deliveroo. They've got they've got a portfolio career already going and have different streams of income. They might appreciate a different approach to what we would ordinarily have classified as just your sort of traditional deductions from one's paycheck.
Yeah, I think what you alluded to around flexibility and choice is also at the heart of us here at Payzar, Mark. We're trying to bring flexibility and choice back into payroll. And I think we've discussed it now a little bit about the employer side, and you started talking about the employee side, Angela, which maybe brings us to your second gift, the reimagined
Yeah.
earned wage access technology. So share your thoughts around that topic with us, please.
Yes, I love earned wage access. And what's so funny, if you had worked with me at Starbucks, I had the exact opposite feeling about EWA. We were approached by a vendor, I won't say who, um, back in 2016 or so, 2017. And I had this real visceral reaction, like, you want people to get paid before payday? What that's no, like, why would we do that? And it's funny when I think about what drove that reaction. I think I was just sort of it was coming from a place one of naivete, but two, I'm a mom, and I think there was a part of me that thought, oh my gosh, most of our population are baristas. Many of them are college students. Some are still in high school, right? They're living paycheck to paycheck, and why would we disrupt, the flow of payday? And so I didn't take the opportunity to educate myself on what could this mean for our employee population. So fast forward, a couple of years, and again, pandemic, kind of coming into play and illustrating where people are really stretched already. But I think this kind of goes back to an employee having a greater degree of control around how they access their money. This doesn't have to be, EWA doesn't have to be a replacement of a payday loan. Payday loans, I know they exist in other countries outside of the US. In the United States, they have a bad rap, and probably for very good reason. The interest rates are very high, the fees are very high. It can almost be deemed as predatory lending in a way. And so I think some employers look at earned wage access as an alternative to a payday loan. And that could be true. That might be appropriate. For me, I think it's less about bridging the gap between paydays. But I think, and there's something to that too, but to me, it comes just back down to employees' choice and flexibility. And there's a lot of different circumstances that one could argue that, an earned wage access program could be beneficial to everyone in some way, shape, or form, not just an employee who gets paid hourly, but even perhaps some of your executives, right? So I think for me, it's about choice and flexibility over everything else. I appreciate that there are some EWA providers that have been around a while. They've gone through a maturity cycle, and they recognize that you want to take as much burden off of the employer's plate as possible if you're going to introduce an EWA program. And those are the providers I tend to lean towards and favor, because I don't want to add extra work to my team. I want to keep the process as clean and simple as possible. But they do come in a lot of different flavors, if you will, and their workflows all sort of vary depending upon the vendor. But when I say a reimagining of EWA, it's not even just the delivery component of the individual's money. But I think there's two parts to that. One is it's not just the delivery piece, but it is. So when I say not just the delivery piece, I'm talking about, as the employer, when you think about cash flow and where does EWA come into play, again, depending upon the provider, the employer might not have any impact to cash flow.
Yeah.
But again, depending on the provider, there could be an impact to cash flow. So that's certainly something that you want to take a look at, and could have an impact, an adverse impact on an organization, and could dissuade them from wanting to stand up or even explore an earned wage access program. The delivery piece, this is where I get really excited. I work for an organization that has people in 50, almost 60 different countries. We have a population that do move around. We have people that are maybe based in country A, but they spend part of their time in country B. And they have asked, could I get paid in multiple currencies?
Yeah.
Or I have, my primary residence in the UK, but I spend 6 months out of the year basically in Spain. Can I have my paycheck go to these two different banking institutions? And we haven't found a solution yet. that can quite accommodate that. The technologies exist, but yet we're struggling, I think, in the payroll space. And I don't know if this is really EWA, but how do we accommodate, or how do we enable that type of practice where somebody might want multi-currency? Or, hey, you know what, this month I'm in the UK, I only want to get paid in British pounds, but next month I'm going to be back in the States. So I want to get paid in US dollars. So being able to have some of that, again, kind of flexibility and choice driven by the employee, I think could be really interesting. And the reason I kind of bucket this under EWA is I think that the organizations that have developed these technologies are probably the organizations that will be able to crack the code on how to deliver pay in multiple currencies, or even crypto, if that, starts to gain traction again. So that kind of leads me to the delivery component as well. And this is where I think, the big players in the payroll technology space are a little bit behind the curve in trying to figure out how do we get on the bus with earned wage access. And I think they waited too long, quite frankly. And that's why they aren't necessarily the dominant players in this space. And they're forging some of those strategic partnerships with the earned wage access providers. And so when I talk about kind of a reimagining of EWA, the delivery piece, the multi-currency piece, the alternative currency component, all of that, I think, is something that if you're a EWA provider and you hear this, like, please, come pick my brain. I'm full of ideas, and I'll send you an invoice later for my time. But I think there's a lot to be had.
Angela.
There's a lot there, right? And so, today, all of the earned wage access providers I've engaged just support the US, or just support Canada, or just support, right? The tech is out there. So let's figure out how to leverage it. And I think, you would have a client base, I think, pretty quickly with some of the organizations, because the appetite's there. We just haven't found the right tech yet. And I don't want to have 7 different EWA providers. I'd love to just have one. So.
In your experience, Angela, because it's interesting, you just mentioned the US and Canada. I'm not sure. So Max and I are both over here in Europe. I'm not sure I've seen EWA as much of a topic in the European discussions. There's some discussion of it, but I think it's still sort of very newish, exploratory.
Yeah.
I think in terms of demand from the employee, community, maybe also lack of awareness. Hey, this is actually something that is doable. But I'm curious, from your personal experience, having worked for various international organizations, do you see that kind of changing? Do you see demand and kind of interest emerging outside of North America?
I'm starting to see it a little bit in South America as well, where there's been some conversation, and I think Argentina is one country that comes to mind where there's been some adoption and some growing interest. Europe is interesting. I think what I have experienced at previous organizations, much of our European-based employees are paid monthly. And at a previous organization, we floated the idea of, do we change the frequency to fortnightly? Would that help with attraction of new talent and retaining new talent? And I got very different feedback than what I had thought. One camp was, we don't really care. If you want to pay us fortnightly, that's great.
Screw the other camp,
like, we don't really care. Do whatever you want. The other camp was really interesting. The feedback was there was a stigma a little bit to the pay frequency, almost that if I'm paid monthly, I am well enough, right? I'm well off enough. I don't need to be paid more frequently. And the feedback was, nobody outright said this, but it was almost, well, if you're a blue collar worker, you might need to get paid more frequently.
Oh, yeah.
But if you're an executive or a white collar worker, you don't need to get paid more frequently.
Right.
That was really interesting. That was not something I had anticipated nor ever really thought about. So it was interesting to have the people that were kind of almost apathetic, like we didn't really care, and the other camp, which were like, why would you do that? Why, like, it would
Right.
almost
Devalue
affect our
your
status a
brand.
little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that could be part of why we're not seeing, uh, not even adoption, but just sort of curiosity around
Mm.
that. And I don't know if over time, if some of that could be perhaps just legacy or generational, if we're seeing, the newer in workforce individuals with the same mindset. I haven't floated the concept of EWA really within our business over in Europe. So
Yeah.
it will be interesting to get sort of we'd like to do that in the coming year and just sort of get the reaction again. Is there even appetite for this? Is it worth the effort? In the States and North America, there's absolutely appetite for it. We tend to have really short attention spans too, and we like things now. Like I want to get paid now, and so it could just be a bit of a cultural difference too. But
I think
yeah.
you're hitting on an interesting point. There's certainly cultural dimensions, but it could also be a generational, and like you said
Mhm.
earlier, there's sort of, I think, a different employment style, right? With
Mhm.
people, in that are getting into the workforce now that are not necessarily working
Yeah,
and work one job for, a full-time job the whole year, the same job.
yeah,
Uh, it could be, I'm working in the summer, I'm working here, and then in the winter, I'm taking
yeah.
time off and I'm traveling. And for them, sort of evening out also their payment cycles from a
Hmm.
cash flow and probably also tax optimization
Yeah.
perspective could be something that becomes more meaningful when you're working,
Hmm.
when you're not working the normal, I'm working 12 months, I'm getting 12 paychecks type of role.
Right, right.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Or even if you have those savvy individuals that maybe do work, maybe they work a seasonal industry, right, where they're very focused for 7 months out of the year and in one country, and maybe the balance of the year they're in another country. We have employees that are very savvy in currency exchange rates, and so it's a small population, I would surmise, but that kind of touches upon what I shared a little bit about the multi-currency payment. And if you have people that have different bank accounts in different areas of the world, giving them that, again, that freedom and the flexibility to choose where to direct their fund. As an employer, I don't know what that would look like for me if I was pushing funds out in different currencies at different rates at different points in the year, right? Trying to forecast that and monitor foreign exchange and trying to hedge and all of that. I could just, my CFO's head's probably exploding. Like, why would we do this? And I can't imagine that you would have a giant population of employees that would want this, but for the few that would find it beneficial, that's kind of where I keep going back to this. How can we give them a choice? How do we open that up to them if they wanted it and that would benefit them in the long run? So yeah, but as far as earned wage access
Fascinating
goes,
topic.
yeah,
It's a fascinating
yeah,
topic.
yeah,
So Angela, we already opened two of our three
right,
Christmas presents under the tree, and both of those I would classify them in German. We would call them a Wundertüte. A Tüte is basically like a little magic bag that
yeah,
has lots of surprising, exciting little things in it.
yeah.
So those were really good. I'm curious about the third one. Is that also a Wundertüte? The parity for payroll in terms of the leadership.
Maybe not quite so much, but I would say as a payroll professional, I think part of your job description is also magician. So I think that's very appropriate. So parity of payroll in the context of leadership. So what I mean by this is if I start off my career in say benefits or as a compensation specialist or reward specialist, my career track, if I wanted it, I could probably become head of total rewards, right? And there are organizations where payroll might fall under, the remit of total rewards, just depending upon the org structure. It is interesting to me that as a payroll professional, it is very difficult to kind of work your way through that same sort of leadership path where you have somebody who was head of payroll for a very long time, who then has rewards or other aspects of remuneration under their remit. And why is that? I guess is one of my first questions to the broader, audience around is, why is that? Why can I take someone who's been very focused and is an expert on executive compensation and have them now be responsible for other aspects of reward up to and including payroll, but not the reverse? Not to say that doesn't happen and that doesn't exist. I'm sure it does, but it's very uncommon. Kind of on the other side of that is, so I'm getting over a cold, so I'm very stuffed up. So I apologize. The other side of that is, up until probably maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I had never met anybody or saw on LinkedIn anybody with the title Vice President of Payroll. I hadn't seen that. And it's exciting today, not only to be in a position like that, but to see a lot of my peers in similar positions. But what's interesting is it's typically, right, VP of payroll, but not VP of payroll and comp and ben, or payroll and accounting, or payroll and something else. So it's interesting to me, and I'm trying to figure out, how do we continue to elevate not only payroll as a profession, but how do we help shine a light on the transferable skills and experiences that one has gained throughout their payroll journey, so that they could, if they wanted to, expand their remit. And that to me is probably something we've maybe done inadvertently to ourselves working in payroll. Right up until 10, maybe 15 years ago, we're very heads down. Payroll was a black box. Leave me alone. I got to get payroll out the door. Yeah. People just knew it happened. And I don't think we did a very good job of taking a minute to really articulate what it was we were doing, how we could add value. And it probably wasn't until we got closer to the pandemic or in the throes of it, where we sort of had to start saying, you can't furlough the entire payroll department. You need us to get through the pandemic. And since then, we have seen, in my opinion, I have personally seen a great emergence of more senior payroll positions than I ever have before. So I think it's wonderful. It's interesting. It took a global pandemic to get to that point, but we've got it now. So what are the things that we can do to sort of develop this parity, not only between payroll, but get it kind of on the same playing field as comp and ben or rewards, et cetera, because it's not quite there yet. So that's something that I will continue to advocate for, and try to find those ways to continue to elevate not just the profession, but what are those skills that could make a payroll professional also a great total rewards leader.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hear you kind of talk about two things. One is kind of the level in terms of title or whatever position recognition within the organization, right? In and of itself, which I know we've talked about a lot in the payroll community, right? Sometimes we'll have the discussion around that kind of topic with the famous seat at the table, whatever terminology we'd like to use to describe that situation. But you're saying something else that I find interesting, is more the it's kind of the breadth of the responsibility. It sounds like the way you're describing it, I think it's, in my personal observation also, I would echo that, quite accurate, that payroll feels a bit like it's more of a one-directional street, right? Coming from payroll and taking a turn into comp ben or finance, accounting, or whatever, it feels incredibly hard and rare, right? Yeah. Whereas someone who's worked in accounting, for them to suddenly say, oh yeah, I've done accounting and I can also oversee payroll, happens all the time, right? Payroll executives that oversee payroll at a senior level, that maybe themselves have never really managed a payroll, but suddenly they're responsible for the
Yeah.
whole payroll operations.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting, and makes you wonder why it has to be only in that direction.
Right.
Payroll doesn't open up the door in the other direction
That's
as
right.
well.
That's right.
All right. Thanks. The parity of payroll in the context of leadership. Well, that's a food for thought under the Christmas tree around the jingle bell. So, Angela, to wrap things up, I'd like to ask you, what is the most challenging situation you faced in a payroll transformation project? And most importantly, how have you overcome it?
Yeah. I should preface this example with the pandemic was the backdrop.
Uh-huh.
And so during this time, the organization that I was supporting was going through their cloud journey for HR and payroll, all going into the cloud. And there was one country's payroll that had yet to be migrated off of the current vendor into the organization's chosen cloud solution. And the budget, the mindset, the appetite to continue the cloud journey were all there. And often those are some of the biggest challenges one has to overcome. But the impacts of COVID were such that the project team was very fragile. You know, people were physically and mentally and emotionally exhausted. And we needed these people. I needed these people. They are subject matter experts in payroll compliance. They understood the cloud technology that we were implementing. Many of them had been with the business for some time. They had held critical relationships within the business. And so the challenge was to find ways to keep this team engaged and motivated, but most importantly, keep them healthy so that the project could come to a successful conclusion. And I mean, I could share tidbits on how to write a great business case and, stakeholder engagement and all of that. But I think as a leader, some of that in some ways is a little bit table stakes, and there's a lot of great material out there. So to address this challenge on engagement and motivation and wellness with the pandemic as a backdrop, that was a challenge I had never faced before. Engagement and motivation, yes, but going through the pressure cooker of the pandemic, I think most would say they'd never been in an environment quite that intense. And so there were three ways or three mechanisms really that I employed to address this challenge. And the first one was just being very real, being very authentic about the circumstances that we were operating in and acknowledging the impacts of COVID on each of us and our loved ones, and the impacts that COVID was having on our industry and our business. Optimism will get you really far, but there comes a point that you have to acknowledge that things are crumbling around you, and this is the whirlwind that we have to operate in. And being real and acknowledging those circumstances signaled to the team that I was not oblivious to real life. And that was incredibly important to the team because they knew that I got it. I'm paying attention. I'm looking at the hours worked. I'm hearing when you're saying my grandmother has now fallen ill and she's in hospital, or my neighbor just died, or being in tune to those things and trying to help manage who could lean in and who needed to step away. I think that went really far. The second thing was finding ways to continue to instill a sense of purpose and ownership. So for some of our team members, knowing that their efforts with this project would have a direct impact to frontline employees was a very strong motivator. So finding those opportunities for some of the project team members to present to frontline employees or to the leadership teams of the frontline employees, that fed that sense of purpose and ownership. And then I think lastly, capitalizing on the opportunities and circumstances that we had right in front of us. So because regulations were changing so rapidly, sometimes daily, because of COVID during this project, the team was in a position to influence and almost co-create functionality and workflow within the application that we were standing up. that was a unique circumstance that was created. And so being able to take advantage of that was a great learning and growth opportunity for some of our team members. In addition, they were able to work directly with some of the vendors' product engineers, and you don't always get that opportunity. And so finding the creative ways to lean into the situation was just another way to keep some of the team motivated and engaged. And that the challenge again goes back to the environment that we were navigating in, and the emotional toll that was being taken on the project team. Again, not a situation I had ever been thrust into, and so it was a really good learning opportunity on how do you sharpen your emotional IQ. It's difficult to be on camera all the time, and there does come a point where we were like, we don't need our cameras turned on. But being able to read body language, listening to what's not being said, all of those things were really critical. And for me, really having to become that much more comfortable leading through such an uncomfortable time when people you're in their living rooms, you're seeing their family on camera, you're listening to how the pandemic is adversely impacting them in their lives. You can't help but become very real in those moments. And that to me, when it comes to transformation projects, that was definitely the biggest challenge I think I've ever been presented.
Well, thanks for
And here
sharing
we are,
that.
we made it through and persevered and grown through it, right? And we have lots of more exciting challenges ahead of us as well.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I think that was excellent, Angela. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas and your wish list.
Thank you for inviting me.
Hopefully, I'm not sure they're going to come true by Christmas. It might be a little bit more work and time that needs to go into some of those wishes. I know Santa tries to do his best, but we'll see how much of that can be delivered.
That's right.
But no, honestly, great inspiring thoughts, and I think definitely scratches my brain to think about, as the holidays are coming up, very sort of big picture dimensions for the industry that you outlined.
That's right.
So I really enjoyed it.
Thank
you. Also, by the way, was really mesmerized by Mr. Max's background today.
It's beautiful.
The northern light, it has a green flavor, just like Pesar, I think, Mark. And we have the Christmas jumpers on, and I would just encourage everyone not to put on Chris Rea, but if they're driving home for Christmas, listen to Angela.
It's the alternative. That is a nice compliment. I like that. Chris Rea or Angela. We'll pick Angela.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Excellent. Well, listen, to everyone listening here, hopefully you enjoyed today's Plug and Pay episode. If you did, please make sure you subscribe and like the podcast. You can find other episodes next to this amazing one on our YouTube channel, as well as in audio format, any of your favorite podcast sites, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. So thank you for listening. Enjoy the holidays. Get some good relaxation in, and some time with friends and family. And in this format, we'll talk to you again on the other side of the year, in the new year. So thank you very much.
That's good. Thank you both. Happy holidays.
You too, Angela. Everyone listening to you. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.